This is an NBC News special report. Here's Tom Yamas.
And good evening. We are coming on the air tonight because President Biden is about to speak to the American people. This will be his first address from the Oval Office, a venue usually reserved for speeches about wars or disasters. Tonight, he'll instead speak about a disaster averted. That disaster was the deadline, just days away, of course, to raise our country's debt limit. If no deal was reached, the U.S. would have defaulted on its debts, likely leading to an economic catastrophe. Tonight, Mr. Biden will tout the deal he reached with Republicans in Congress to raise the debt limit, a deal that passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan support, but also with fierce opposition from members on both sides of the aisle. Progressive Democrats are unhappy with the cuts Mr. Biden agreed to get the deal, including cuts impacting social welfare programs. Conservative Republicans arguing the cost savings are not enough and that the national debt is still ballooning. The deal passed the Senate late last night and the House the night before it. It now heads to the president's desk, where he plans to sign it this weekend, just ahead of that June 5th deadline this upcoming Monday, which is the date the Treasury Secretary warned would be when the U.S. would run out of money to pay its obligations. We're going to peel back the curtain a little bit right now. We're not allowed to actually see the president walk up to the Oval Office. The shot comes up once he's there, and here he is.
My fellow Americans, when I ran for president, I was told the days of bipartisanship were over and that Democrats and Republicans can no longer work together. But I refuse to believe that, because America can never give in to that way of thinking. Look, the only way American democracy can function is through compromise and consensus. And that's what I work to do as your president. You know, to forge bipartisan agreement where it's possible and where it's needed. I've signed more than 350 bipartisan laws thus far in almost 2.5 years, including an historic law that rebuilding America so that we can rank #1 in the world in infrastructure instead of where we're ranked now, number 13 in the world. Another historic law, rebuilding our manufacturing base so that we'll lead the world once again in making semiconductor chips, so much more and so many more sophisticated ones. And now, a bipartisan budget agreement. This is vital because it's essential to the progress we've made over the last few years, is keeping full faith and credit of the United States of America and passing a budget that continues to grow our economy and reflects our values as a nation. That's why I'm speaking to you tonight, to report on the crisis averted and what we're doing to protect America's future. Passing this budget agreement was critical. The stakes could not have been higher. If we had failed to reach an agreement on the budget, there were extreme voices threatening to take America, for the first time in our 247-year history, into default on our national debt. Nothing would have been more irresponsible. Nothing would have been more catastrophic. Our economy would have been thrown into recession. Retirement accounts for millions of Americans would have been decimated. 8 million Americans would have lost their jobs. Default would have destroyed our nation's credit rating, which would have made everything from mortgages to car loans to funding for the government much more expensive. And it would have taken years to climb out of that hole. And America's standing as the most trusted, reliable financial partner in the world would have been shattered. So it was critical to reach an agreement. And it's very good news for the American people. No one got everything they wanted, but the American people got what they needed. We averted an economic crisis, an economic collapse. We're cutting spending and bringing the deficits down at the same time. We're protecting important priorities, from Social Security to Medicare to Medicaid to veterans to our transformational investments in infrastructure and clean energy. I want to commend Speaker McCarthy. You know, he and I, and our teams, we were able to get along and get things done. We were straightforward with one another, completely honest with one another, and respectful with one another. Both sides operated in good faith. Both sides kept their word. And I also want to commend other congressional leaders. House Minority Leader Jeffries, Senate Majority Leader Schumer, Senate Minority Leader McConnell. They acted responsibly and put the good of the country ahead of politics. The final vote in both chambers was overwhelming. far more bipartisan than anyone thought was possible. So I want to thank the members of Congress who voted to pass this agreement, which I'm going to sign tomorrow and become the law. So here's what the deal does. First, it cuts spending. And over the next 10 years, the deficit will be cut by more than $1 trillion. And that will be on top of the record $1.7 trillion I already cut the deficit in my first 2 years in office. And it's clear we're all on a much more fiscally responsible course than the one I inherited when I took office 4 years ago. When I came to office, the deficit had increased every year the previous 4 years. And nearly $8 trillion was added to the national debt in the last administration. And now we're turning things around. And that's good for America. You know, my dad used to have an expression. He said, Joey, don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget. I'll tell you what you value. And that's at the heart of this debate. What do we value? Protecting seniors. You may remember during my State of the Union address, there was a spirit exchange between me and a few Republicans spontaneously occurring on the floor of the House of Representatives. I was pointing out that for years, some of them were putting forward proposals to cut Social Security and Medicare. And some of them that night took exception, and they said very loudly that that wasn't true. So I asked them on the floor that night, I said, ask them a simple question. Will you agree not to cut Social Security, not to cut Medicare? Would they agree to protect these essential programs? They're a lifeline for millions of Americans. Programs that these Americans have been paying into every single paycheck they've earned since they started working. And that provides so much peace of mind. With the bright lights and cameras on, those few Republicans who were protesting, they agreed. They said they wouldn't cut it. That's how we protected Social Security and Medicare from the beginning and from it being cut, period. Health care was another priority for me, a top priority. I made it clear from the outset, I would not agree to any cuts in Medicaid, another essential lifeline for millions of Americans, including children in poverty, the elderly in nursing homes, and Americans living with disabilities. The original House Republican proposal would have cut health care for up to 21 million Americans on Medicaid. And I said no. And Medicare was protected. And so were millions of people most in need. Look, I've long believed that the only one truly sacred obligation that the government has is to prepare those we send into harm's way and care for them and their families when they come home and when they don't come home. That's why my last budget provided VA hospitals with additional funding for more doctors, nurses, and equipment to accommodate the needs of veterans and more appointments. The House Republican plan would have meant 30 fewer million VA healthcare visits for our veterans. But we didn't let that happen. In addition, this bill fully funds the Bipartisan PACT Act, the most significant law in decades for veterans exposed to toxic burn pits and for their families. It expands access to those veterans and their families to health care and to disability benefits. Look, we're investing in America and our people and in our future. We've created over 13 million new jobs, nearly 800,000 manufacturing jobs. Where is it written that America can't lead the world again in manufacturing? Unemployment is at 3.7%. More Americans are working today than ever in the history of this country. And inflation has dropped 10 straight months in a row. In this debate, I refuse to put what was responsible for all this economic progress on the chopping block. This bipartisan agreement protects the law that will help us build the best infrastructure in the world. It fully protects the CHIPS and Science Act, which is going to bring key parts of our supply chain to America, so we don't have to rely on others, like semiconductors, those tiny computer chips smaller than the tip of your finger that affect nearly everything we rely on, from cell phones to building automobiles to the most sophisticated weapon systems and so much more. We protected another law that I passed and signed last year that finally beat Big Pharma, which I've been trying to do for over 30 years. It finally gives Medicare the power to negotiate lower drug prices, just like the VA has been able to do for veterans. This law has already dramatically cut the cost of insulin for seniors. from as much as $400 a month to just $35 a month for insulin. Negotiating lower drug prices not only saves seniors a lot of money, it saves the country a lot of money. $160 billion that's not having to be paid out because drug prices are more rational. We pay the highest drug prices of any industrial nation in the world, and it's just the beginning. You know, we also protected the most significant breakthrough ever in dealing with the existential threat of climate change. Today, new wind and solar power is cheaper than fossil fuel. Since I've been in office, clean energy and advanced manufacturing have brought in $470 billion in private investments. That's going to create thousands of jobs, good-paying jobs, all across this country, and help the environment at the same time. Remember, at the beginning of this debate, some of my Republican colleagues were determined to gut the clean energy investments. I said, no, we kept them all. And there's so much more to do. We're going to do even more to reduce the deficit. We need to control spending if we're going to do that. But we also have to raise revenue and go after tax cheats and make sure everybody's paying their fair share. No one, I promise, no one making less than $400,000 a year will pay a penny more in federal taxes. But like most of you at home, I know the federal tax system isn't fair. That's why I kept my commitment, again, that no one earning less than $400,000 a year will pay a penny more in federal taxes. That's why last year I secured more funding more IRS funding to go after wealthy tax cheats. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, and it is nonpartisan, says that this bill will bring in $150 billion, and other outside experts expect that it would save as much as $400 billion because it's forcing people to pay their fair share. Republicans may not like it, but I'm going to make sure the wealthy pay their fair share. I'm also proposed closing over a dozen special interest tax loopholes for big oil, crypto traders, hedge fund billionaires, saving taxpayers billions of dollars. Republicans defended every single one of these special interest loopholes, every single one. But I'm going to be coming back, and with your help, I'm going to win. Right now, catch this, right now the average billionaire in America pays just 8% in federal taxes. 8%. Teachers and firefighters pay more than that. That's why I proposed a minimum tax for billionaires. Republicans are against it, but I'm going to keep fighting for it. No billionaire should pay less in federal taxes than a teacher or a firefighter. Look, let me close with this. I know bipartisanship is hard, and unity is hard, but we can never stop trying. Because in moments like this one, the ones we just faced, where the American economy and the world economy is at risk of collapsing, there's no other way. No matter how tough our politics gets, we need to see each other not as adversaries, but as fellow Americans. Treat each other with dignity and respect. To join forces as Americans to stop shouting, lower the temperature, and work together to pursue progress, secure prosperity, and keep the promise of America for everybody. As I've said in my inaugural address, without unity, there is no peace, only bitterness and fury. And we can never become that country. I can honestly say to you tonight that I've never been more optimistic about America's future. We just need to remember who we are. We are the United States of America. And there's nothing we can't do when we do it together. So thank you all for listening, taking the time tonight to listen to me. May God bless you all, and may God protect our troops. Thank you.
And we've just been listening to President Biden in his first Oval Office address saying that he's going to sign tomorrow that debt limit bill, which will, of course, avert the first ever default on the nation's debt. I want to go right to our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander. Peter, you know, he walked through several parts of the bill. He did say this: no one got everything they wanted, but the American people got what they needed. Give us the top lines where Americans will be feeling this bill in the coming days and weeks.
Tom, I got to tell you, this felt a lot like a campaign speech. This is the message we're going to hear repeatedly from President Biden heading into 2024. The president focusing on some of those key buzzwords like bipartisanship and compromise, to the point you just made about how nobody got everything they wanted, but Americans got exactly what they needed here. The president repeatedly touted his accomplishments over the course of the last couple of years and how many of them happened with Republicans on board, including the infrastructure law and also the CHIPS Act that helps produce more semiconductors in this country. But the bottom line is, it is striking to hear from the president speaking for the first time behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office on this issue. But the White House, and conversations I've had with aides here, indicate they recognize the urgency of this moment and how important it was to avoid what have been the first ever default for the United States. The president also touting economic news with another 330,000+ jobs tonight. The president trying to make sure he can speak to the political middle in this country, not the extremes on either side, but the Americans, including those independents who could sway the election ahead in 2024. Tom.
Peter, we thank you for that. Peter did mention the politics of all of this. I want to bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Hallie Jackson. You know, President Biden campaigned on this, and he was attacked by progressives. He'd said he worked with Republicans, but compromise is a word we haven't heard a lot in Washington recently. And at the top of his remarks, he even commended Speaker McCarthy.
He nodded to the House Speaker, as he has done a couple of times in this process so far, saying that he believes that both sides negotiated in good faith here. What is so interesting is the policy context to this, which is so critical. It would have been a global economic catastrophe if the U.S. had defaulted on its debt. But there is obviously a political stage setting for the 2024 campaign. And I will tell you that in my conversations with those close to the White House, they point to this moment as perhaps evidence that the president can point to down the road that he can be a force for stability and for bipartisanship, getting this deal done. You mentioned that hat tip to Kevin McCarthy. Keep in mind, Kevin McCarthy can come out of this with something to point to as well. He corralled his Republican conference here to get this across the finish line. It was only a few months ago that we were talking about whether Kevin McCarthy could even become the House Speaker at all with those 15 votes. And now here he is. It is a feather in his cap as well. You make the point, Tom, that it's not often that we can talk about compromise in Washington. It's also not often that we can talk about something being kind of a win-win for both sides. And by the way, for the rest of the country, too.
I was just going to tell you this. Both sides are saying they got a little from each of them, both touting this as a victory. And it's different because we haven't seen that in a while.
And it's strategically important because both sides also have bases that are not necessarily thrilled with what they've done. You mentioned the progressive left for President Biden. Kevin McCarthy on the Republican side is going to have to deal with these conservative hardliners who are not thrilled with how this went down. It's not all, you know, singing kumbaya down the road, Tom, but it is certainly a moment where we've avoided some economic issue, and the president can move forward here.
All of this, as we, of course, look ahead towards 2024, right. President Biden, of course, going to be campaigning at some point very, very soon. And the Republicans at it as well, out on the campaign trail. Hallie Jackson, Peter Alexander, we thank you so much for joining us. That concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have much more coverage on our streaming network, NBC News Now, and for some of you, coming up on Nightly News Tonight. I'm Tom Yamas in New York. We thank you so much for watching this special report.